everyone, it is Reese here, and I'm coming to you with a slightly different video today. So I'm going to do in my skills selection some videos on presenting and how to prepare a presentation, a conference paper, etc. But I've also been asked to sort of use my skill set as a horror scholar and sort of analyse some films generally. And the ones that sort of kind of immediately leapt out when I started was the Stranger trilogy by Renny, Harlin. So these are 3 films that have emerged consecutively over the past 3 years. I've seen all 3 and was quite bored and underwhelmed in truth by all of them. But I wanted to sort of explore, I've sort of made a career in a sense in many of the book chapters I've written on finding nuggets of gold and finding sort of interesting things in some really, really bad films. So I wanted to think about these films and think about whether there was any case to be made that they were sort of doing something quite interesting. And that leads me to sort of this presentation, in which I want to talk about the Strangers films as a form of meta commentary on the horror genre as it stands at the moment. And let me give you a little bit of a backdrop to begin with. So the films came out, as I said, chapters 1, 2 and 3, releasing in 24, 25, 26 respectively. This is a trilogy. It's consecutively shot, so they were all shot at the same time, and they follow a central character called Maya, played by Madeleine Pesch, and the titular killers. So she has a partner in the first film who is killed. There are sort of various people in the community as well, the local sheriff, the waitress at the diner, all that sort of stuff. And the films were absolutely slated. They, did sort of vaguely well, box office wise, but they bombed. They really, really did, and for sort of different reasons. So chapter 1 was really criticised for essentially following exactly the same plot beats as the original Strangers film in 2008, but doing so worse and doing so less effectively. And the second and third films were criticised by sort of essentially not being particularly scary, for having some violence but not really. They dove into the backstory of the titular killers, and this was again highly criticised. And there was a sense really that sort of there was no real justification for these 3 films to exist as 3 films. Sort of it could have been a very tight, taut film of sort of 90 to sort of 120 minutes. But there is sort of these films, as they stood in their own right, didn't really warrant the release strategy that the studio had opted for. There's been a lot of criticism about these things for failing to be scary, and for the first one for really sort of failing to sort of capture a cultural zeitgeist, which I'm going to talk about, of the original film in 2008. And the question I want to ask, though, for this thing, is whether the negative reviews and commentary about these films as sort of being throwaway, nothing films that sort of add nothing, is sort of missing the point. Might it be the case that sort of there is meaning in the films and we're sort of misidentifying it? Is this the case? I'm going to sort of claim so and sort of illustrate what I think the meanings are. If we're talking about sort of readings of these films, I suppose initially we should ask what meanings exist inherently in the Strangers lore anyway. So there have been 2 films prior to this, and the 2008 film, the original by Brian Bertino, and then a sort of a semi-sequel that came 10 years later, The Strangers Pray at Night, Johannes Roberts. And these films, particularly the first one, have really had some degree of reading in them in popular and critical writing. The first film has really been aligned with sort of the mode of 9/11 horror. This is a horror where violence and death sort of occurs from anywhere, and it can happen to anyone. The case where essentially you look at things where sort of people are tortured, gravely wounded, and there's not always inherently a justification within the world of the film for why these particular people have been selected, and violence being kind of almost non-discriminatory. Kevin J. Wetmore, in his excellent book on 9/11 horror, notes the ending of the film, in which the Liv Tyler character asks one of the killers why they have attacked them, and the answer is simply because you were there. It's sort of violence that is almost kind of meaningless in its own right, that happens just because it happens. There's been less writing on Johannes's film, but what I think is sort of noteworthy is the way it sort of evokes sort of an 80s aesthetic, so lots of sort of neon lights in the trailer park setting where it takes place, a famous sequence, shot to the sound of Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart, sort of an attack in a swimming pool. I would argue that it kind of ties into sort of a contemporary culture for nostalgia, and the latest book, an edited book, talks about this. Things like Stranger Things, all the legacy sequels that have emerged, are really sort of capturing a mode of kind of 40 years ago and bringing it back to life in contemporary culture. And this crops up in lots of different ways in the horror genre and further afield. So these films have been linked to sort of specific cultural moments. I don't think the Harlin Strangers films really do that. I don't think they're really sort of talking about America and sort of where its culture stands, so much as that they sort of kind of offer commentary on the meta dimensions of contemporary horror. What do I mean by this? It's sort of capturing traits and tropes of where the industry is at the moment, and almost kind of satirising them or playing with them in an ironic way. Let me talk about what I mean through sort of recourse to each of the three films. Chapter 1, I mean, the nice thing, of course, with films being chapters is that it offers quite a nice organising structure. So as I say, sort of Chapter 1 is essentially kind of the same story, the same sort of plot beats as the 2008 film, and lots of reviews notice this. I've cited one by Garlington, where he called the film essentially a carbon copy, and it is the case that sort of these kinds of direct remakes have been highly criticised in horror circles, especially the more direct ones. Psycho famously. I've cited Laura Mee's excellent book Reanimated on contemporary remakes, about the fact that sort of when you're getting to the 2010s, this slew of kind of uninventive, or at least framed as uninventive, remakes is kind of sort of the bête noire for sort of what is bad within sort of horror as a genre generally. So the question I would ask is, how does the film adapt? How does it innovate, if indeed it does at all? We can't assume that it does. But there are some dimensions where it does, not least the introduction of sort of this culture of suspicion, and sort of the introduction of kind of a wider community around the strangers, and the suggestion that essentially the darkness has emerged from a particular community. But also the fact that, kind of by its very nature, the fact that it positions itself as a first chapter and sort of at the end of the film says that there will be a second one. It's doing this thing that horror always does of sort of revitalising older IPs and sort of recognisable IPs. The Strangers are not perhaps Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger, but they are sort of recognisable, with an explicit view to make a franchise out of them. Explicit view that these are sort of a series of films. It kind of ties into sort of the MCUification of cinema at the moment, in that kind of we are brought into a world with a sense that it is a world. It is not just a single self-contained narrative, that there will be more to emerge out of it. There have been many criticism of this at the moment. I can talk about that in a later video, but sort of this is obviously, clearly, with its production strategy and its positioning of chapters, what Chapter 1 is doing. So I move to Chapter 2, which is perhaps in a sense the least interesting of the films, because it is essentially one giant chase sequence. The Madeline Petch character is pursued throughout the entire film. She meets characters who are killed, and she gets attacked. It's not really a narrative-driven film, because there's not really that much narrative to it. Sort of it begins when she's in the hospital after the events of the first film, and I'll discuss the ending shortly. So the analysis here, I think, can't really be focused on sort of any sort of narrative implications of the film, because it doesn't really get into that. And really, I think it sort of aligns with sort of a tendency for sort of interest in true crime media, and the sort of spectacle of violence, where we get to see the strangers pursue and kill. And sort of one of the film's most talked about sequences, again not in a positive way, takes place sort of in the middle of the film, where Maya, the Madeline Petch character, is hiding in the middle of the woods, and is attacked by a giant CGI boar. And although this is kind of connected to the backstory of the killers, there's sort of the sense of this is sort of gratuitous, this is violence almost for the sake of it, this is violence to generate sort of a spectacle. Aligned with this is where the franchise starts digging in to the backstories of the killers. It looks at two of them in this film, though predominantly focuses on the pin-up girl whose mask you see in the poster on the slide there. a sense of sort of a lot of criticism for answering questions that no one needed the answers to. The original sort of mystery of the strangers was that they were strangers. They could have been anyone, and violence could be wrought anywhere by anyone. But it digs into the history and then culminates in sort of the grand sequence at the end where Maya kills a pin-up girl, where one of them, as I've put on the slide, there is brought to justice through sort of death, and they are unmasked as a character that we recognise. There's a kind of a convention of the slasher genre and sort of the crime genres, in that sort of motivations are explained, backstories are revealed, and identities, in the case of mass killers, are revealed. Really, the thing that really got me thinking about this and brought this all together was the release of Chapter 3 earlier this year, which is essentially a trauma narrative. So the film begins immediately after Chapter 2, and the death of Pin-Up Girl and two surviving strangers. And they dispose of the body, and they capture Maya once again, and she undergoes several traumatic responses. She disassociates from the violence, but then she's brought along to the scene of a new killing. She's implicated in the violence. She wipes out one of the other strangers at this killing, but then is forced to hold the hand, forced to hold a weapon and kill someone. She doesn't do it, but sort of the sack face, the male stranger, holds her hand and makes it happen. She's implicated in a cycle of violence, and there's a sense really that sort of violence is kind of secular. In these films, we learn that the sheriff of the town and the male masked stranger is his son, and that they sort of protect them and sort of overlook the violence, providing the community is safe. The violence can only be inflicted upon strangers to the community. What I would say is this is kind of a period, the cinema at the moment being heavily characterised by trauma films and grief films, and sort of everything being a metaphor for trauma and grief. And the film ends supposedly with Maya overcoming this by killing the sheriff, by killing the last stranger, but she takes a mask away with her. The implication is that this trauma will continue. There's a threat almost of secularity, both in terms of cycles of violence and based on the reception to this franchise, on essentially a threat that the strangers may return once again. And this is sort of a general overview look. What I would suggest is that the failure of the franchise there, and the considerable backlash around it, might reflect our own dissatisfaction with some of the tenets of media that it reflects. That if we are angry at remakes, if we're angry at trauma narratives, if we're angry at sort of this interrogation of backstories of criminals and killers, that might be a reflection of where we are as and that might be a reflection of where we are and sort of how we're positioned as viewers. It might be asking us to sort of critically reflect whether the same situation would be true if the films had been positively received. I don't know, but this is kind of what how I'm going to read these Strangers films, and that inherently by breaking down this section, the film, which is essentially one story, into individual chapters, it sort of forces us to sort of critically reflect and read them that way. I'll be intrigued to hear if people agree with me or disagree with me on that. What I would say, the Strangers films, they're not good films. They're poorly paced, they're not particularly frightening, although sort of Madeline Petch is sort of quite an okay lead. There's nothing really in the films that inherently invites watching. I don't think they're that interesting. I think this was not the way to sort of put these films together, and I think although I watched although I'm making the case that I think there is critical commentary there, I think they are reflecting something about sort of where the culture is at the moment. That doesn't come as a recommendation. That simply means I think sort of consider these films, sort of try and dig into these films a little more and see what they have to offer, because I think there is stuff there to offer. So I finish speaking there. Let me show you my references. I would say thank you very much for watching this video. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these films. If you watched them, did you like them? Did you not like them? And if there are any other films, any other things that you'd like me to analyse or discuss, please do comment below. I make these videos sort of in large part based on the sort of response and feedback I get, so please do sort of share if there's stuff you want me to talk about. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, and make sure to ring the bell so you know when the next video comes in. Thank you very much, everyone, and I will look forward to seeing you all in the next one.